A document that was officially released to the United States Congress has triggered serious concern among China's leadership. The 2025 annual report from the USA Department of Defense focusing on military and security developments related to the People's Republic of China. This is not an internal memo. It is a formal assessment submitted to Congress reflecting the Pentagon's mainstream view of global strategic risks. One notable point in the report is that the relationship between China and India is being treated as a strategic flashpoint. According to the U.S. Department of Defense's assessment, China is trying to project a softer image along the line of actual control, the LAC, in order to keep the situation from sliding into open confrontation. However, beneath that outward calm lies a set of highly calculated strategic moves. Ladies and gentlemen, the question is, why would Beijing choose to de-escalate? The report offers two main reasons. First, China sees India steadily moving closer to the United States, not only in defense procurement, but also through strategic dialogues and security cooperation frameworks. A clear example is New Delhi's active participation in the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue, Quad, alongside Washington, Canberra, and Tokyo, the U.S. India relationship has rarely been as strong as it is now. That reality forces China to adjust to avoid pushing India fully into an anti-China alignment. Second, amid an increasingly volatile global geopolitical environment, Beijing is compelled to acknowledge that no major power, whether the United States, China, or India, wants a full-scale war. However, the peace that exists today remains temporary and fragile. The Galwan Valley incident in 2020 is proof of that. When Chinese forces moved closer along the LAC, the Indian military responded forcefully, resulting in casualties on both sides. Beijing understands that if similar incidents continue, the risk of a larger-scale conflict cannot be ruled out. In addition, the report points out that tensions in places such as Ladakh, Taiwan, and across the entire LAC existed even before major global crises erupted. Those crises included Russia's military campaign in Ukraine on February 24, 2022, and the Hamas-Israel attacks on October 7, 2023. When those wars unfolded in close succession, the world entered a period of instability unlike anything seen in recent decades. That situation pushed China to think more carefully, not only because it fears conflict, but also because international pressure and uncertainty have become harder to predict by the day. Another strategic factor forcing China to adjust is India's diversification of weapons suppliers, reducing reliance on any single country. At the same time, India's commercial relationship with the United States continues to deepen, tied to one of the world's largest consumer markets. Meanwhile, China, given its immense manufacturing capacity, does not depend on importing goods from economies like India, meaning it cannot use trade leverage as an effective strategic tool in the same way. In that context, China has little choice but to show temporary goodwill toward New Delhi to avoid being pushed into direct confrontation. Beijing's real objective is to prevent India from fully joining the U.S. camp, because that would create a severe strategic imbalance across the Indo-Pacific. The core issue comes down to a calculation Beijing cannot ignore. If China wants to stop India from drawing closer to the United States, it cannot keep operating in permanent confrontation mode. Every time tensions flare at hotspots like Ladakh, Taiwan, or Galwan, it further reinforces India's belief that conflict with China is unavoidable. When strategic trust erodes, New Delhi is left with one practical path: strengthen its military capacity and seek advanced weapons from the West. In that picture, the United States emerges as an ideal defense partner, not only because it is the world's largest weapons supplier, but also because of its clear political commitment. Washington has consistently conveyed the message that China is a shared challenge for countries in the region, and that effective cooperation should run through mechanisms like Quad At the same time, the United States has accelerated the AUKUS initiative, a distinctly military-leaning strategic partnership with the United Kingdom and Australia, marking a major step toward building a regional deterrence network. This sequence of moves by the United States and its allies is making China feel a growing sense of strategic encirclement. In Beijing's view, India, the world's most populous country, must not be pushed completely into the opposing camp. As a result, maintaining at least a minimum level of workable relations with New Delhi is no longer optional. It is a strategic requirement to preserve balance in the region. Even so, the larger challenge remains. If the security spiral continues accelerating, the risk of a large-scale military confrontation across the Himalayas and in surrounding maritime space cannot be dismissed. Competition for influence is pushing all sides closer to red lines, where even a small misstep could trigger consequences that are impossible to control. One section of the report to the U.S. Congress is especially noteworthy. It highlights the role of Arunachal Pradesh, an area China places on its list of core interests at a level comparable to Taiwan. That means Beijing rejects any form of negotiation or compromise related to sovereignty over that territory. This is a warning signal China has repeatedly sent, and the United States is now treating it with a level of seriousness not seen before. According to analysis, among policy planners in Washington, China's alertness regarding Arunachal Pradesh is nearly comparable to how it treats the Taiwan Strait. While there are differences in approach, the trend of expanding the definition of red lines beyond internationally recognized borders sends a dangerous signal. Beijing is increasingly confident in setting spheres of influence according to its own standards. However, when viewed through the lens of strategic countermeasures, a major difference between China and the United States becomes clear. Beijing pursues long-term goals, planning changes over decades. Washington often prioritizes short-term problem solving, focusing on stabilizing the immediate situation, and sometimes appearing willing to trade future leverage for quick results. That difference creates a strategic gap China may be able to exploit. In particular, if U.S. partners such as India do not maintain sufficient vigilance, Beijing appears to be looking for ways to use that difference in strategic tempo to preserve the initiative in disputed areas. The contrast between the two powers is not only visible at the policy level, it also reflects deeper historical experience and national identity. For China, Arunachal Pradesh is not merely a disputed region. It is a red line similar to Taiwan, something Beijing believes cannot be crossed or conceded. That point is emphasized in the 2025 U.S. Security Report and reflects the practical assessment of American intelligence and strategic communities. A clear expression of this hardline posture is Beijing's repeated strong objections whenever India's prime minister or senior officials visit Arunachal Pradesh. China has not hesitated to issue formal diplomatic protests, asserting the area is Chinese territory and demanding that New Delhi not send officials to the disputed land. This is not routine diplomatic signaling. It is a consistent sovereignty claim strategy executed over many years. Washington is watching these signals closely because Beijing keeps reaffirming that it will not compromise on Arunachal. Like Taiwan, this indicates that the Asian power is broadening the scope of its core interests in ways that are increasingly detached from international law or diplomatic recognition. U.S. strategic analysts view this trend as alarming because it could set precedents for other hotspots. Beyond territorial questions, the Pentagon report also lays out a long-term forecast. By the year 2049, exactly 100 years after the founding of the People's Republic of China, Beijing aims to complete what it calls the Great Rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. The core objective is not only to become an economic superpower, but to build a modern military force capable of fighting and winning in major conflicts on a global scale. To pursue that ambition, China has invested heavily in its navy, which it views as a key instrument in future strategic confrontations. As of 2025, China has surpassed the United States in the number of warships, becoming the country with the largest navy by hull count in the world. However, quantity does not automatically equal dominance. The U.S. Navy still holds clear advantages in global deployment capability, multi-theater operational capacity, combat endurance, and command and control technology. The competition between the two superpowers, therefore, is not simply an arms race. It is a strategic contest between two different military models. One side follows long-term planning and steady investment. The other side responds more flexibly across phases and circumstances. This gap may not be obvious in raw numbers, but it is a decisive factor in a power struggle expected to define the 21st century. Beijing does not hide its goal that by 2049, China will possess a military that can not only defend its territory, but also prevail in a comprehensive confrontation with the United States. This is the scenario US. Security reports have repeatedly warned about. In practice, Beijing is moving at remarkable speed, advancing military technology, modernizing command structures, and building overseas logistics and support hubs. On the other hand, if India truly intends to become a power capable of effective deterrence, it will need to modernize its defense approach. Incremental weapons procurement in small batches is not enough to build a force strong enough for an increasingly competitive security environment. Defense investment must be paired with long-term thinking, real-world deployment capability, and the ability to integrate power across services. A deterrent-capable military cannot be built through temporary approvals. It must be the product of strategic planning, synchronized modernization, and the ability to fight across multiple fronts. China understands this clearly and is doing everything it can to ensure the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, can hold the initiative under any scenario. One reason China continues to take a hard stance in disputes is its assessment that India has not yet reached a level of strength sufficient to impose meaningful counterpressure. When an opponent does not feel deterred, it will keep pushing, and that is precisely the strategic gap New Delhi must close quickly if it wants to hold its place in the Indo-Pacific security balance. A clear example is the current condition of India's Air Force. For many years, the country has remained stuck at roughly 42 squadrons. Yet after the 1962 border war with China, a war committee directed by Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru recommended at least 65 squadrons to protect national airspace and maintain deterrence against threats from the north and east. Delays in Air Force modernization are not simply about budget constraints or technical obstacles. They also reflect a systemic gap in national defense strategy. When a military lacks credible deterrence, the country will repeatedly find itself on the defensive. And once an adversary recognizes that weakness, as China did at Galwan, the result can be dangerous clashes that push the entire region toward instability. Returning to the Galwan Valley clash on the night of June 15th, 2020. This is widely seen as the bloodiest confrontation between the two countries in 45 years. Under harsh conditions, at an altitude of 4,000 meters, Indian troops from the 16th Bihar Regiment, led by Colonel B. Santosh Babu, carried out a mission to stop PLA forces from building structures near the LAC. A surprise assault by Chinese troops using crude weapons, iron rods, spiked clubs, rocks, and batons led to a brutal hand-to-hand fight that lasted for hours in darkness and freezing conditions. The violent clash on the bridge and along the Galwan riverbank caused heavy losses on both sides. India lost 20 service members, including Colonel Babu, and 76 were wounded. According to U.S. intelligence assessments, Chinese fatalities may have reached 35 to 43, while Beijing officially acknowledged only 4 deaths. The Galwan incident marked the end of the fragile peace along the border and forced both sides to deploy an additional 50,000 troops to the region, opening a prolonged phase of tense negotiations. An even deeper consequence was a shift in China's military training mindset. After Gaoan, the PLA intensified exercises simulating combat in high-altitude terrain, where thin air and survival conditions are extreme. Especially in Tibet, training cycles were conducted under the command of the Western Theater Command, reflecting serious preparation for real conflict scenarios rather than symbolic drills. At Galwan, Chinese troops were forced to confront the reality that they lacked endurance for prolonged high-altitude combat, where low oxygen and rugged terrain demand specialized survival skills. Large portions of the PLA had not been trained deeply enough for that environment, leading to significant drops in combat performance, an exposed weakness Beijing has been determined to correct after paying a high price. By contrast, the Indian military has a substantial advantage in experience and resilience, with permanent forces stationed in places like Siachen, where elevations exceed 20,000 feet, often described as the coldest battlefield in the world. Indian troops there are accustomed to surviving and operating in freezing conditions and severe oxygen deprivation. This creates a tactical advantage at high ground positions, turning harsh terrain into a natural fortress against incursions from China. Indian troops, especially those who have served in Siachen, Kargil, or Ladakh, are seasoned fighters with extensive real-world experience under extreme conditions. They have spent years living and training in some of the harshest climates and highest elevations on Earth. Meanwhile, after the setback at Galwan, China was forced to rapidly adjust its training system, placing heavier emphasis on compensating for physiological and tactical weaknesses in high-altitude operations. According to the 2025 U.S. Defense Report, in 2024, China held large-scale military exercises in Tibet, an area directly adjacent to India's border. The drills involved multiple elements of China's Air Force, the PLAAF, mechanized infantry units within the PLA, and additional supporting forces. Notably, the training locations were in areas where oxygen levels were extremely low, about 25 to 30% lower than at sea level, showing that this was a test of real combat capability in high-altitude terrain. China was not only exercising, it repeated these drills multiple times in areas that could become border flashpoints, making the intent clearer. Beijing is preparing for conditional conflict scenarios, not necessarily a full-scale war, but enough to change local realities on the ground. This is no longer defensive training. It is a readiness cycle for offensive action under specific conditions. In public messaging, Beijing continues to emphasize peace, stability, and friendly cooperation with New Delhi. But what is happening in practice points in another direction. Training intensity has increased. Exercise locations are moving closer to the LAC, and the simulated scenarios are oriented toward harsh combat environments along contested border areas. This contradiction between words and actions is exactly what has raised deep concern among Western military experts. The lesson from Galwan taught the PLA that the Tibetan Plateau, while useful for mechanized movement, no longer guarantees an advantage if China crosses the LAC and pushes deeper into Indian territory. At that point, Chinese forces would face steep and rugged terrain, logistics, bottlenecks, and rising physiological strain from low oxygen and extreme weather. What appears to be a disadvantage for India becomes a natural advantage that China would need years of training to match. However, that advantage is not permanent. China is pouring resources into boosting high-altitude combat capability, building specialized training centers, and creating systems designed to help troops adapt to mountain battlefields. The goal is clear. If conflict breaks out, the PLA must be ready and must not fall into a reactive posture like it did in the opening phase at Galwan. If such a conflict occurs, this will be a key deciding factor. Whoever controls the terrain and adapts faster will gain an advantage that may be extremely difficult to reverse. That is why China is not only moving forces toward the border, but also building structured training to seize the initiative from the very first moment. In the report submitted to Congress, the Pentagon specifically notes that the goodwill China displays toward India is a temporary strategy meant to delay confrontation and buy more time. Beijing's ultimate target is not New Delhi, but Washington. And India is simply an obstacle that must be managed on the road toward direct competition with the United States. Every move now, training force deployment and foreign policy posture, is part of the preparation for the next phase of superpower competition. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the end of our video. Thank you for your attention and for watching. See you again in our next videos.